Therapy Chat Podcast, episode 212.
This is the Therapy Chat Podcast with Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. And now, here's your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C.
Today's episode is sponsored by Therapy Notes. Between writing notes, filing insurance claims, and scheduling with clients, it can be hard to stay organized. That's why I recommend Therapy Notes. Their easy-to-use platform lets you manage your practice securely and efficiently. Visit therapynotes.com to get 2 free months of Therapy Notes today. Just use the promo code TherapyChat when you sign up for a free trial at therapynotes.com. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. Today, we are going to revisit the topic of dissociation, and I've put together 4 past episodes on dissociation. You'll be hearing me talking about a brief introduction to dissociation, and followed by my interview with Kathy Steele, where she talked about structural dissociation. And then we will have my interview with Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS, Internal Family Systems, where he talks about multiplicity parts. And then you'll hear my wrap up where I talked about his interview in a little more detail to help break things down a bit. I hope you will enjoy listening. And then next week, very excited to bring you an interview with Christine Forner from the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. And we're going to talk about dissociation more. After you listen to this episode, I'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, thoughts that were raised by hearing this conversation, these 4 conversations. And as always, you can leave me a message on SpeakPipe or through email at therapychat.podcast@gmail.com. So I would love to hear from you. Therapy Chat Podcast wouldn't exist without the support of its listeners. If you'd like to become a member, please go to patreon.com/therapychat. By making a $1 per month donation, you can help Therapy Chat keep going over the long haul. Thank you for your support. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. Right now, it is the weekend after July 4th, which is a holiday in the U.S. And I am coming to you with a little preparation episode so that when you listen to next week's episode, which is going to come out on July 18th, you'll be kind of more familiarized with what we're talking about because, I think I take it for granted that people are aware of the topic that we're going to be discussing next week, but not everyone really is. So to lay the groundwork, I wanted to give you a little bit of background. So first of all, before I start on any of that, I've referenced this in a couple of episodes recently. I have been running around like a chicken with my head cut off, as they say, since May, because my practice recently moved. We moved right down the hall in the same building we were in before, but the expansion from a suite that had 2 therapy rooms to one that has 4 and some other extra rooms is a huge deal with me as the owner, kind of, coordinating everything and responsible for everything. So while I do my normal work of seeing clients and my normal work of running this group practice with right now 4 clinicians and 3 more by September, I'm also juggling all the little ins and outs and details of moving, which has been exciting and stressful. So with that said, the reason I'm really even mentioning that is because we're going to have this week's episode and next week's episode on the topic that I'm about to tell you about. And the rest of the summer until September is going to be some replays of past episodes that are about trauma. You know, I'm always talking about trauma, but if you just started listening to the podcast recently, you know, you've only heard what I've most recently been talking about, and there have been some really good episodes in the past. I didn't even realize until a couple people have emailed me that on iTunes, you can only listen to the 100 most recent episodes of Therapy Chat. So now that Therapy Chat has been around for a while and you're listening to episode 189, there are 89 episodes that you can't find on iTunes. And so not everyone realizes that all the episodes are available on therapychatpodcast.com. But also, in case you don't know this, if you're a newer listener, I used to talk about it a lot, and I haven't been doing that so much lately. You can find every episode of Therapy Chat on the Therapy Chat app. So it's a free app, unfortunately, still only for iPhones and iPads and Macs. I haven't gone to the lengths of creating an app for Android capability, but if you have an Apple product, you can find the Therapy Chat app for free on iTunes, and every episode is there. It makes it very easy to share episodes and just listen to all of them in order from most recent to the first one. Another way that you can find all the old episodes is on YouTube, but I'm going to select a few that are related to trauma and reissue them this summer for you to listen to. And when you hear what I'm talking about today and next week, I hope you'll be very interested in getting more information about trauma by listening to those past episodes. There's some real rich stuff back there. So I know I've referenced what we're going to be talking about a few times without saying what it is, but I didn't want to just casually throw it out there. What we are going to be talking about today is dissociation. Dissociation is something that many people are not familiar with, even therapists. People who are doing trauma therapy as therapists need to know about dissociation because it's a part of the trauma response. And if you don't know about dissociation and how to treat it, you're missing a huge aspect of the healing process. And it kind of, to be honest, it kind of can be re-traumatizing because not seeing what's going on can be like a reenactment of a childhood where there was abuse happening and everybody pretended like it wasn't. So it's really important. And it's just such a huge piece of trauma work that if you don't know about it, it's time to learn. And I'm going to give you a bunch of information today and a lot of great resources. And then next episode on July 18th, 2019 will be an interview with Kathy Steele, who is really an amazing figure in dissociation work. She's been doing this work for a long, long time and has been a pioneer. So I didn't want to just bring her episode without a little pre-work. So when I say dissociation, you may not know what I'm talking about. Many people call dissociation disassociation, but there's no extra A in there. And I'm going to share with you some information that I'm going to point you to where I got this from so you can go back and read more about it if you would like. I am getting this information, which is written more succinctly than I could possibly explain it myself, despite the fact that I have a lot of training and experience in working with dissociation. I got this from the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation website, www.issd-d.org. If you just look up ISSTD, you should be able to find it in Google. So first of all, what are we talking about when I say dissociation? Dissociation is a word that's used to describe the disconnection or lack of connection between things usually associated with each other. So dissociated experiences are not integrated into the usual sense of self, and it results in discontinuity in conscious awareness. Dissociation can affect consciousness, memory, identity, or perception. What this might look like if you're a therapist is when your client comes in and rattles off a long list of traumatic experiences they've been through with no emotion, seemingly very detached, maybe even somewhat robotic in the way they're describing it, when the things that they're saying, would be extremely terrifying, horrifying, traumatic for them to have gone through. And I think because of not knowing enough about dissociation, what a lot of times therapists may misunderstand and think that the person is not telling the truth because and certainly, I hope most therapists wouldn't think that, but certainly many non-professionals would think that when they hear someone just, describing one traumatic event after another, and showing no emotion, average person who doesn't know much about mental health may think, well, their reaction doesn't seem to match what they're saying, so they must be lying. That can't be true. If that were really true, they would be crying and screaming and curled up in a ball. But that's exactly what dissociation does, is it protects the person from feeling the emotion that is connected to that experience. So, in clinical terms, dissociation is emotional numbing, and it's a psychological process that's common in people seeking mental health treatment, although it's not always recognized. So some examples of how someone might feel when they dissociate this is all from ISSTD. A person may feel taken over by an emotion that does not seem to make sense at the time. They might feel suddenly unbearably sad without an apparent reason, and then having the sadness just go away as quickly as it came. Or they may find themselves doing something they wouldn't normally do, but they can't stop themselves, almost as if they're being compelled to do it. And we've heard this in terms of parts. We've heard this in terms of who's driving the bus. Is it your adult self driving the bus, or is it your thrill-seeking 15-year-old self or 5-year-old self? And where's the adult current self is that person even on the bus? So dissociation is something that we all do unconsciously, and it's somewhat of a spectrum how much someone may dissociate, all the way from being distracted and preoccupied by thoughts and not hearing what someone's saying when they're talking to them, to losing memory of experiences, to having no memory of childhood, to all the way to the far end of the spectrum, which would be when the person has different parts of self that show up and there's no awareness between the different parts. So, there may be one state that someone shows up in and they have a conversation and they have feelings, and then they shift to a different state, and that part doesn't know the other part is there and has no memory of what happened. Okay, so here's what ISSTD says about the cause of dissociation and dissociative disorders. So dissociation is something that everyone does, and dissociative disorders are more at the far ends of the spectrum. According to ISSTD, research tends to show that dissociation stems from a combination of environmental and biological factors. The likelihood that a tendency to dissociate is inherited genetically is estimated to be 0, it says. Most commonly, repetitive childhood physical and/or sexual abuse and other forms of trauma are associated with the development of dissociative disorders. That does not mean if you dissociate that you have been sexually abused and you don't remember. However, any type of trauma in childhood, including a lot of medical procedures, surgeries, severe illness in childhood, losses like the death of a parent at an early age, a parent who is extremely depressed or dissociative and was your primary caregiver, extreme neglect, extreme physical abuse. And when I say extreme physical abuse, I mean, I think any physical abuse is extreme. But when I say extreme neglect, I'm talking more about not having your basic needs met for food, shelter, safety, warmth. And then there's emotional neglect, which can also cause dissociation. So it says dissociation may also occur when there has been severe neglect or emotional abuse, even when there has been no overt physical or sexual abuse. Children may also become dissociative in families in which the parents are frightening, unpredictable, or dissociative themselves, or make highly contradictory communications. And I've talked a lot about that here, when there's incongruence between what the parents say and what they do. That's extremely scary for children because they don't know what to believe. So the development of dissociative disorders in adulthood appears to be related to the intensity of dissociation during the actual traumatic event. So basically, when you're a child and you're relying on other people to help you when there's a crisis, if the person you're relying on is the one who's causing the crisis, for example, if they're your parent is physically or sexually abusing you or doing something terrifying, or you're witnessing something horrifying happen that your parent is doing, like witnessing domestic violence. Dissociation is a highly adaptive coping method that a child uses to be able to bear what's happening. An absolutely terrifying situation where they feel powerless. They are powerless. The only thing they can do is go away in their mind. So that's why dissociation is a normal response to overwhelming, terrifying situations. So severe dissociation during the traumatic experience increases the likelihood of generalization of such mechanisms following the events. So the experience of ongoing trauma in childhood significantly increases the likelihood of developing dissociative disorders in adulthood. So another example is if you're a child and you live in a violent community and there's violence happening all the time and you've seen people be shot on your block and you've seen children being hurt, you've seen people being bullied, you've seen, people being attacked by a group of people or living through war, you still have to go out and play and you still have to walk to school or drive to school, get on the school bus. You still have to go about your normal life. So how does a child continue to go through their normal life when things like that are happening around them that they sense are unsafe? And that's where dissociation comes in and helps them not remember what happened so that they can continue to keep on going. Okay, so I want to give you the different types of dissociative disorders. Okay, so there are 4 main categories of dissociative disorders according to, at least as far as the U.S. mental health community goes, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, the DSM-5. And as imperfect as this document may be, this book may be, it's what we in the U.S. have to work with for diagnosis. So according to that, the 4 dissociative disorders are dissociative amnesia, dissociative fugue, dissociative identity disorder, and depersonalization disorder. And I'm going to give you some info on what each one is. But as I said, remember that dissociation is on a spectrum. So people could exhibit dissociation without fitting neatly into one of those categories. And that might be a little confusing for both, people who are curious about their own trauma responses and for therapists. Dissociative amnesia is characterized by an inability to recall important personal information, usually of a traumatic or stressful nature, that's too extensive to be explained by ordinary forgetfulness. It can't be due to an organic disorder or DID, and this is the most common of all dissociative disorders. Individuals suffering from dissociative amnesia are usually aware of their memory loss, and the memory loss is reversible because it's not a problem that the memories aren't stored. It's a problem that they cannot retrieve them. A dissociative fugue, and that's F-U-G-U-E, fugue, is characterized by a sudden, unexpected travel away from home or one's customary place of work, accompanied by an inability to recall one's past and confusion about personal identity or the assumption of a new identity. Individuals suffering from dissociative fugue appear normal to others. So basically, it's when someone goes out and they are presenting themselves in public as a different name and different behaviors than the one they generally present themselves with in public, and then they don't really remember it. So it can be extremely upsetting and confusing for people to find out that someone told them they saw them somewhere. Like, I saw you at McDonald's and you were carrying a squirrel and you said that you were going to get a Big Mac. And normally you're a vegetarian and normally wouldn't go around carrying a squirrel and you don't remember it. That would be pretty terrifying. And especially, if you don't remember it at all and there's a sense of like, well, what else did I do? So oftentimes when I've heard that happen to people, there will be anywhere from a day to a week that they don't recall. But for the people who saw them, for example, that person who saw you at McDonald's, they couldn't tell anything was wrong other than it was odd that you were getting a Big Mac because you were a vegetarian, and it was odd that you had a squirrel with you. And I'm just giving like a real random example. Okay. Depersonalization disorder is characterized by a persistent or recurrent feeling of being detached from one's own mental processes or body. Individuals suffering from depersonalization disorder relate feeling as if they are watching their lives from outside of their bodies. Somewhat like watching a movie, or I know it's my body, but I feel like it's not me who's there, who's inside. Individuals with depersonalization disorder often report problems with concentration, memory, and perception. And this depersonalization must occur independently of DID, substance abuse disorders, and schizophrenia. One thing that isn't mentioned here as one of the types of dissociative disorder is derealization disorder, which is the kind of the other side of depersonalization disorder, in which rather than feeling like someone is not like, I know it's my body, but I don't feel like it's me. That would be how depersonalization feels. Derealization is like, I know it's me, but what's around me seems fake, or I feel like I'm in a movie and it's not real. And these people are all just characters. Both are very disconcerting and leave people just feeling like they don't know which way is up, and they really just want to get back to feeling like themselves again. Okay. So dissociative identity disorder, what we call DID, used to be called multiple personality disorder, and most popularly characterized in pop culture. Back in the 80s, there was a movie called Sybil, which had a very dramatized portrayal of dissociative identity disorder. And then more recently, there was a show called The United States of Terror with Toni Collette. That was also a depiction of dissociative identity disorder, but also, not fully accurate. I mean, Hollywood is never going to make mental health seem truly accurate, but dissociative identity disorder, DID, is the most severe and chronic manifestation of dissociation. It's characterized by the presence of two or more distinct identities or personality states that recurrently take control of the individual's behavior, accompanied by an inability to recall important personal information that is too extensive to be explained by ordinary forgetfulness. It's now recognized that these dissociated states are not fully formed personalities, but rather represent a fragmented sense of identity. The amnesia typically associated with DID is asymmetrical, with different identity states remembering different aspects of autobiographical information. And it says that there's usually a main personality who identifies with the client's real name and is not aware of the presence of other alters. The different personalities may serve distinct roles in coping with problem areas. So that is DID. And when I talk with Kathy Steele next time, she's going to talk about structural dissociation and help us understand DID better. And then there is dissociative disorder, not otherwise specified, what they call DDNOS. So that is a dissociative presentation that does not meet the full criteria for any other dissociative disorder. In clinical practice, this appears to be the most commonly presented dissociative disorder and may often be better characterized by major dissociative disorder with partially dissociated self states. In terms of diagnosis, I personally think of dissociation as being a part of post-traumatic stress disorder. And if it's to the level of the separate, fragmented states that really don't know about each other, I would go ahead and give a diagnosis of DID. And if I were strongly suspecting that someone had DID, but they didn't quite meet the criteria, I may diagnose DDNOS. So the information here about the prevalence of dissociative disorders is, I think, a little, it's just somewhat incomplete, because some people say that dissociation and DID is so rare that, you could practice for 30 years and never see someone who has DID. But I think it's a lot more prevalent than we realize, and it's just not being identified accurately. So there are estimates that dissociation occurs in approximately 2 to 3% of the general population, up to 10%. It says that approximately 73% of individuals exposed to a traumatic incident will experience dissociative states during the incident or in the hours, days, and weeks following. But for most people, these experiences will subside on their own within a few weeks after the traumatic incident subsides. However, if they try to go back and recall that incident, will they be able to? I think that's an important question. So ISSTD has data on the prevalence of dissociative disorders, and also what types of treatments have been studied in working with dissociative disorders. I am going to give you some resources. I think right now this is pretty deep to ponder already, and we're going to talk more next time with Kathy Steele, but I want to give you some resources to get more information, including a surprising and incredible resource, I think, that I can't wait to share with you. So first of all, I've mentioned ISSTD a couple times. I'll put a link to their website in the show notes. There's a book called Wisdom, Attachment, and Love in Trauma Therapy by Susan Pease Bannett, LCSW, and she also is the author of the Trauma Toolkit book. You may remember Susan was a guest on Therapy Chat. Can't believe it's already been a long time back. I think it was last year. I'm looking to see. Yeah, it was last summer on episode 152. Susan and I talked, and she's really amazing. She's another person I totally look up to, who has been a pioneer in the work of dissociation. And she also specializes in ritual abuse and mind control, which has its own particular dissociative impact. So that's episode 152. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Another person who is hugely important in the work of dissociation is Janina Fisher. Janina Fisher's book, Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, Overcoming Internal Self-Alienation, is a must-read. It's really fantastic. She talks about using a bottom-up approach with trauma survivors to help them basically reconnect and integrate so that the fragmentation is lessened and the person feels like all the states can be together. There's so many great people who have done this work, and I can't name them all right now, but Babette Rothschild has done a lot in the trauma world, and her books are really important in this field as well. Of course, also sensory-motor psychotherapy, Pat Ogden, and Pat Ogden's two books, Sensory-Motor Psychotherapy and Trauma in the Body. I'll put links to those in the show notes too. It's a lot to read. Kathy Steele, Anno Vanderhart, and Suzette Boone wrote Treating Trauma-Related Dissociation, a Practical Integrative Approach, and Coping with Trauma-Related Dissociation, Skills Training for Patients and Therapists. I'll put links to both of those in the show notes, and Kathy's going to talk a little bit more about those books next time. But I think the most surprising and incredible resource it's a podcast called System Speak. I found out about this podcast when Susan Pease Bannett was on the podcast, and she, when she promoted that episode that she did, and I saw it, I was like, what's System Speak? And when I looked into it, it's incredible because the person who created System Speak is actually a system of dissociated alters, Emma Sunshaw and her system. I'm reading this from System Speak website, systemspeak.org. Emma Sunshaw and her system were diagnosed with DID by a licensed therapist and psychiatrist following inpatient treatment for a significant fugue experience and related trauma issues. Prior to this experience, Emma had functioned well for nearly 20 years as a doctorate-level clinician until both of her parents passed away. The layers of this experience triggered a collapse of protective walls that had thus far sustained them internally, leading them to seek treatment. So what I understand is that Emma was a clinician working for almost 20 years as a therapist, and the loss of both parents triggered this episode that led her to being diagnosed with DID, which she had never realized that she had because she was just functioning. So Emma, also known as Dr. E, has retired from clinical work now and does not have an office caseload at this time. And her podcast is not intended to give medical or therapeutic advice. But if you listen to System Speak, you hear basically a firsthand account of living with DID from a person who has the clinical understanding because she practiced for almost 20 years. For me, it's a great gift that this podcast exists. And when I listened to the episode with Susan Pease Bannett, I was like, man, I wish I could do that. It was so good, and it was so organic and really just incredible. So I highly recommend listening to System Speak. Pat Ogden was recently interviewed, which is amazing. I want to listen to that one. I just found that out when I was doing a little research to tell you all about System Speak. So you can get all the information about System Speak by going on systemspeak.org and look at About Us. But I greatly admire what Emma and her system are doing with that podcast. It's very important. And for many people living with DID, I know it must be an amazing resource. And for us therapists who work with people who've experienced trauma, and almost all of us probably have our own trauma too. So it's a really valuable resource. So that should be enough for now. I'm going to leave you with this. And then if you have any questions about what I've shared, if parts of what I've said today were not clear, which is highly possible, feel free to reach out to me by email at therapychat.podcast@gmail.com or go to therapychatpodcast.com and click on the Speak Pipe button. You can leave me a voice message. I love hearing when you call in with those messages. If there are, a few questions, I may do a follow-up episode addressing those questions. And I would be fascinated to know if this is something that you already know about, whether you're a therapist or not. Is this anything that you have known about before you listened to this? And what did I leave out? I mean, it's a huge topic, and I'm by no means the be-all, end-all expert on this subject, but, there are many who know way more about it than I do, and then I know there are many who hardly know much about it at all. So I'm just hoping that this will help all of us understand more. So until next time, thanks for listening to Therapy Chat. I always appreciate you listening, and I can't wait to hear what you think of this and next week's episodes. Take care. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. Today, we are going to have a highly esteemed guest and someone who I feel very honored to be able to talk to and learn from with all of you listeners. My guest today is Kathy Steele. Kathy, thank you for being my guest on Therapy Chat today.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. I'm really grateful that you have given your time to me and our audience today. I know that you are a well-known author, co-author of several books, and a specialist in complex trauma and dissociation. Can you just give our audience a little bit of information about yourself and your work?
Sure. I have a practice in Atlanta, Georgia, and I have been actually in the same private practice for almost 30 years, which has been really wonderful. And now I spend probably 60% of my time doing training and about 30% doing consultation, and the rest of the time I see clients. So that's sort of how I'm working it these days.
That's wonderful. And I know that people who are listening, once they start hearing this discussion, they're going to want to find out how to get in touch with you for training and consultation. So we'll give them that info at the end. The reason I asked you to be my guest on Therapy Chat is that you are someone who has really done so much to educate therapists about trauma and dissociation. And I think it's something that many therapists really don't realize is a common issue.
Right. And I think it's really interesting that there are so many people, particularly therapists who are on the front line, who are working, say, in mental health centers, and they see so many people who have really complex trauma, not just personal trauma, but social trauma as well, poverty. And these things have huge impacts on people. So the more we can understand about the effects of complex trauma and dissociation, with dissociation being a particular kind of effect of complex trauma, the better we can actually work with our clients and help them to improve.
Yes, because if we don't recognize that dissociation is a factor, we may be treating something and missing a whole huge aspect of what's really happening. Am I right?
That's right. And so many clients come to me having had previous treatment and to be honest, it was really good treatment, but it wasn't addressing their underlying dissociation. And so they continue to have a lot of difficulties. And when they get to a therapist who can actually identify it and work with it in a rational, reasonable way, the clients are so grateful and say, this is the first time I felt fully understood. This is making a difference in my symptoms. So it's very important to identify dissociation. And that's really tough because dissociation means different things to different people. Sometimes when a person comes to me for consultation, they say, oh, my client is dissociating. And I always want to ask, well, what do you mean by dissociating? And some people will say, well, my client's spacing out. That's a very common form of, we might call it dissociation, but it's not necessarily related to trauma. We all space out when we're tired or preoccupied or sick or stressed. It's a normal kind of experience. But as we get more into the realm of complex trauma, the symptoms get more complicated. For example, many people who have complex trauma don't remember what happened to them, at least some of what happened to them.
Yes.
And this is called dissociative amnesia. And this has nothing to do necessarily with spacing out, although it can be related. So we want to really clarify what do we mean when we say our client is dissociating. One of the other main definitions of dissociation is really these fragmentations in a sense of self. And this was actually the original definition of dissociation 150 years ago that was proposed by Pierre Janet, was a French psychologist and psychiatrist who was really sort of the grandfather of dissociation. And so my colleagues and I have always returned to his work to think about the most original, pure definition of dissociation, because things like spacing out weren't added to the definition until actually about the 1970s.
Sounds like a 70s thing.
Yeah, spacing out was definitely a 70s thing, but it's also happening now. But I think beginning to understand that there are many different kinds of experiences that we call dissociation, and then being able to assess for them, because, for example, the treatment of spacing out is different from the treatment of a fragmented sense of self. With spacing out, you really want to focus on mindfulness and being present. You want to do that with a client who also has a fragmented sense of self, but you also, in that case, really have to work to bring these unintegrated aspects of self more together into a sort of coherent, cohesive whole sense of self, that so that I can say, for example, I am me across time and context from the time I was born until my current time. That's all me. It belongs to me. And this is something that's lost in people, many people who have complex trauma and dissociation.
So let me ask you, if you will, just in case those who are listening haven't really heard about the term complex trauma, can you define that in the way that you mean it for everyone? So we're on the same page.
Complex trauma is also known as developmental trauma, in that it is trauma that is chronic, pervasive, and it happens early in development from say, birth to the teens. And many people who have what we call complex trauma have had many years of trauma. Mostly we're talking about child abuse. I think complex trauma also covers other issues like war and political torture, those kinds of things. But mostly we use it to think about people who've been abused and neglected as children.
And for you, are you including emotional abuse and neglect in that as well?
I am. Emotional abuse and neglect tend to have a somewhat different trajectory than the kind of physical trauma or sexual trauma in which a person is held down and immobilized, or they feel like their body integrity is being threatened.
Mm-hmm.
That produces other kinds of defenses. But emotional neglect can lead to pretty profound sense of disconnection from yourself, depersonalization, depression, a sense of purposelessness. I mean, it can be pretty severe.
Definitely. So I think that I wanted to ask that because for many people, they may say, I didn't experience any kind of child abuse at all, or, war or poverty or anything. We always had everything we needed, and, but they still have these symptoms. And so I wanted to just give people that extra little piece.
Well, and the reason they have those symptoms is because our early relationships need to be good enough that we can learn to regulate ourselves in the context of those relationships. And if we don't learn early to regulate our emotions and calm ourselves down because we have caregivers who help us with that, then we spend a lifetime being unable to regulate. And that's why many people end up using alcohol and drugs, because those are sort of chemical regulators. They calm people down. So I think it's really important to know that a healthy emotional attachment is very necessary for normal growth and development of a child. So definitely the absence of that has a profound effect on children.
Thank you. So now that we have a definition that we're all working with of what complex trauma is, can you say how you would define dissociation?
Yes, I certainly can. And I think I would make a distinction. I usually make this distinction. There are four kinds of processes that people think of as dissociative. And the first one we talked about a little bit, which was spacing out or thinking about something else and being really distracted. That's one thing. The next thing is depersonalization, where I don't feel in my body. I don't feel like things are real around me. Maybe I'm walking around like I feel like I'm in a fog or in a dream, or some people describe it as I'm on a stage in a play and I'm watching myself. That's a perceptual kind of issue that is often related to trauma. The third thing that dissociation is sometimes called is a physiological shutdown, like when people are really threatened. If we go back to an animal model, if a deer is being chased by a lion and the lion catches the deer will actually collapse. And we see possums do the same thing. Their whole physiology shuts down in an effort to protect them from feeling physical pain when they're attacked, and they have no hope of escape. And so some people call this physiological state dissociation. But what we know about dissociation proper, which is if we go back to good old Pierre Janet, we really see that there is a fragmentation or division or dissociation, those words are used interchangeably, a dissociation in the sense of self or in the personality. And of course, self and personality are not things. I can't pull out something and say, well, here's myself that you can see, or here's my personality. They're mental representations, but nevertheless, they're representations of sort of enduring ways of being. And if we take the example of a young child who is being sexually abused at night, or perhaps physically abused very severely, and then he or she has to get up the next morning, sit at the breakfast table with the same person who's been abusing them, act like everything's okay, and go off to school and go about daily life. There's no way for them to continue to hold that terror and pain and betrayal and go on with daily life. So they have to find a way to separate it. And this is where dissociation has its onset at these kind of breaking points of, I cannot begin to carry this into my daily life, and I have to leave it behind in order to continue to cope. So people begin to get this split between their self that is really stuck in the trauma as though it's still happening, and their self that is trying desperately to go on with normal life while still avoiding the trauma. So that is sort of the definition of what my colleagues, my co-authors, and I call structural dissociation. Not that there's a literal structure inside, but it's structural in terms of an organization. It's how we organize ourselves when we become too overwhelmed by trauma to continue. And that trauma happens over and over and over again in the context of a normal daily life, which is really different from the context of, say, a war, where everything around you is crazy. This is a child who's bouncing back and forth between a crazy, horrific experience and going to school like nothing has happened and not being able to talk about it. So that is what we think of in a kind of nutshell as what we call structural dissociation. And this is something that you will see in clients who have complex PTSD and certain dissociative disorders. There are two certain dissociative disorders. One is called, it's a mouthful, other specified dissociative disorder, or OSDD. And the one that is known because of its terrible media portrayals is called DID, or dissociative identity disorder, in which case people do have these alternating identities. But there's so many myths around that particular disorder that it's terribly misunderstood, and people don't even know what to look for in the disorder.
So true. I mean, people, we have these exaggerated portrayals or just completely inaccurate portrayals that are in films and, even sometimes news reports. And if the therapist has that as what they think DID looks like, of course, they're not really seeing that in their clients, but
that's right. That is very rare. I think I've seen like 4 cases like that in my lifetime of specializing in this area.
So I know there's kind of a common belief that DID and dissociative disorders are extremely rare.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard therapists say you won't ever see one in your lifetime. Well, and I know that's not true.
Right.
I've only been a therapist been out of school for 9 years, and I've worked with a few people who had those diagnoses. So how common what's your stance on how common that is?
Well, it's not just my stance. There have been prevalence studies all around the world.
What are the facts? That's what I should have said.
Yeah,
what are the facts?
Right. And the facts are that OSDD is approximately 6% of the general population, and that is about the percentage of the general population that has major depression.
Oh.
So that's pretty common.
Yeah.
So this is sort of the lesser form of DID, not the more extreme, the OSDD. And then when we get to DID, there have been various studies that show this between 1 and 4%, I think 1 to 2% of the general population, which is slightly more than the population who has schizophrenia.
Okay.
So if we think about the prevalence of major depression and schizophrenia, well, wow, then we're really seeing that quite a number of people have this disorder in the general population. And then if we move up to populations who come to therapy, addiction populations, eating disorders, people who are just coming for childhood trauma, then the rates are much higher in those clients because they're coming from the highly traumatized group of people out of the general population.
That makes sense.
I think it's much more common than therapists recognize, except that most therapists have never ever been taught how to assess for it.
Exactly. So can you talk about that a bit?
Right. I mean, it's a kind of long conversation, but I'll talk about a couple of categories of symptoms that you would want to look for. And the first category is amnesia. And the most common amnesia that we see is people who are saying, I know bad things happened to me, but I don't really remember anything between the ages of 4 and 8.
Right.
Right. We know people don't remember much, if anything, before the age of 3, and they don't have a whole lot of clear memories before the age of 5. But by then, we would expect them to have a pretty continuous set of memories. So people will come and say, I think I've blocked it out, or I have a memory that's like Swiss cheese.
Mm-hmm.
I have black holes that people have told me stories, and that's how I can tell you what happened to me. So we're looking for amnesia in the past. What we're looking for in dissociative identity disorder often is also some degree of amnesia for the present time. And so there are specific questions to ask. For example, do you lose time in the present? And a client might say yes. And then I would really want to know, well, are you losing time because you're spacing out? That's one issue, which doesn't indicate the person has DID. Or are you losing time because you're acting in the world without recognizing what you're doing? And so you find things that you've done that you must have done, but you don't remember doing. Or you find things that you've bought at the store that you must have bought, but you don't remember buying. These are kind of significant, frightening experiences for clients, and they're often ashamed to tell you. they often have lived with this amnesia for so long, they don't recognize that they ought to be sharing this as a symptom. Sometimes people wake up during the night and they, in a different state of mind, they're drawing or they're writing, and they wake up and find these drawings and writings that are very disturbing to them. And they say, I must have done it, but I have no recollection of doing it. So that's one category of symptoms, these amnesia symptoms. A really important category of symptoms are symptoms that actually overlap with what we're used to thinking of as psychotic symptoms. And these are symptoms, for example, of hearing voices. Typically, therapists have thought of hearing voices as a psychotic process. But we now know that many people, even in the healthy population, hear different kinds of voices, and it's the quality of the voices that we're concerned with and the impact of those voices in everyday life. And so people who are dissociative often hear voices of different parts of themselves internally. For example, they might hear a child crying, or they might hear a very berating, critical voice screaming at them that sounds very much like their abusive father. So hearing voices is a signal in people who have complex trauma that you need to further assess for dissociation. Feeling like your thoughts are withdrawn. Like one of my clients would say, somebody just took that thought away from me. And it's a strange thing to say. Now, of course, I lose my train of thought and I say, oh, I just forgot what I was going to say. But it doesn't, for me, that doesn't have this jarring kind of frightening experience that my client had, that somebody jerked that thought out of my mind and won't let me say it.
Yeah.
So it's the quality of it is different. A feeling like I have an emotion, but it's not my emotion. One of my clients, for example, would cry and say, water is coming out of my eyes, but I'm not sad at all. Or one of my clients says, that's somebody else's sadness. So you can begin to see how these symptoms, which sound kind of crazy in some way, begin to make sense if we think of these are different aspects or parts of a person that are just more separated than they should be, and they need to find a way to be more coherent. So we're not talking about a person having different personalities or different people inside. It's not like that at all. It's just these discontinuities in experience that a good therapist can really help the client begin to bridge those discontinuities, to feel safe to bridge them, and over time accept all of these aspects as parts of me. They're like one of my clients, as she was beginning to integrate some of these parts, she said, oh, that little girl, that 7-year-old girl is me, and what happened to her happened to me. And that's a huge realization that a person hasn't been able to make while they're in the middle of their complex PTSD or dissociative disorder, because those disorders are meant to help the person separate from the trauma to go on with daily life.
Right. Protecting them.
That's right.
So a question's coming up for me right now, just in the way you are discussing OS, dissociative disorder, and DID. I've heard people say that dissociative disorders can be on a spectrum, and DID is kind of at one side of the spectrum.
Yes.
And I work with many people who have complex trauma and who do have kind of the fragmentation, but there's more kind of co-consciousness or awareness with it. And it's not separate.
That's right. It is separate and it isn't separate. It's kind of a weird mind-bending thing, Because a person can say, well, I visualize this inner child that's like 3 years old and she's cowering in a corner. And I know that's me, but it doesn't feel like me, right?
Yeah.
And so there's some separation, but not total separation, as opposed to a client with DID who would say, well, there's this 3-year-old and that's not me at all. I don't even know who she is. Or not only that, but I hate her and I don't want anything to do with her because she should have stopped that abuse and she didn't.
Mm.
So it is on a continuum, this continuum of being able to accept and realize that what happened to me, that I have certain feelings about it, that I have certain experiences. So the more a person can acknowledge that those imaged representations of self, like a teenager or a child part, is me, the closer they get to integration.
Okay. Thank you for saying that, because I just wanted to have my mind following along with you without a question that was like making me not be able to take it fully in.
Right. And I think those of us who aren't dissociative can really relate to this because it is on a continuum. I can have a day where, let's say, I'm irritable and I'll say, I just wasn't myself today.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, then who was I? So that statement, I wasn't myself, is a statement about, gee, I have to really work on integrating and accepting the fact that sometimes Kathy Steele is irritable, even though that's not her normal state. It is one of her states. And so I have to accept more that, well, indeed, that is me. Right? Or we can say that wasn't like me to do that. But of course, it may not be like our usual state of mind, but it still was me who did it. So there are these little minor lapses in our sense of self because self is not a unitary construct or idea. Our self is sort of this conglomerate that we put together of all of our experiences across time and across situations. And myself is always changing and adapting. So self is this really fluid, dynamic construct that we sort of too often think of as this singular thing, entity that we were born with. And that's not at all the case of what self really is.
Oh, thank you for that. So I know I kind of interjected with the categories of symptoms that you were describing.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a complete description of what you wanted to say on that?
No, not at all. I think that what we really want to look for is amnesia is a criteria for DID. So there must be some degree of amnesia in order to have DID. People with OSDD, the sort of lesser form, aren't required to have amnesia, but they may have it. And people with complex PTSD may have it. But what we're looking for is a kind of sufficient fragmentation in the sense of self or personality so that the client is having symptoms of not being in control of their behavior, their feelings, their sensations. So they're either having intrusions of those things or they're losing those experiences. And I'll give some examples to be clear. An intrusion of a feeling would be like my client saying, well, there's sadness in their tears, but it's not my sadness.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an intrusion of sadness that doesn't feel like mine. It's coming from another part of me. I might have, as a dissociative client, the intrusion of physical pain that's like a partial memory of the trauma, like the physical pain part of it. But it just feels like it comes out of the blue and has absolutely no context. That again is an intrusion from another part of self. I can have the intrusion of that voice. So those are the intrusions. The losses would be things like a client of mine would go into the kitchen, and she would stand at the edge of the kitchen and just start to cry, because she said she would walk to the kitchen and all of a sudden the kitchen looked really huge to her, and she had the experience of not knowing how to cook or fix food. And so she ended up having to get all these ready-made things like yogurt or granola bars or something to eat, because whenever she went to the kitchen, she lost the ability to figure out how to cook. And this actually was related to the intrusion of a child part who didn't know how to cook, and that not being able to cook had something to do with her neglect and abuse. But it intruded on the client so that she actually lost her ability to cook.
Wow.
So that's one example of a loss. Another example is a client can say that she feels numb in her body. And this numbness, this anesthesia in your body, is a symptom of dissociation. So I had a client once who said, I don't feel my body except for my hands. And she would touch her body and say, it's just numb. It's like touching somebody else's body. I don't feel it at all. So that's a loss of sensation. So when we're looking at these things, and there are these long lists of these kind of intrusions and losses that you can check with your clients, these are the kind of things we're wanting to look for. We're also wanting in dissociative disorders to make sure that the person also has symptoms of PTSD, because dissociative disorders are sort of an extreme form of post-traumatic stress disorder. So they're going to be having intrusion, numbing, and hyperarousal, and sometimes hypoarousal related to the trauma. So it's a very long list. There are definitely places people can get those lists to learn to do good clinical interviews. There are some measurement instruments you can use. I think it takes some skill to use them, but you can. The most common one out there is the DES, called the Dissociative Experiences Scale. And it's a fine screening tool, but it doesn't tell you if somebody has a dissociative disorder. And you could get a high score on it just because you're very, very spaced out, not because you actually have a dissociative disorder. So even though it's a common screening and it's helpful to at least get a ballpark idea of where somebody is, it doesn't really help you make the diagnosis. And it never was intended to do that.
Yeah. And I think that especially if they have a lot of amnesia, it could be, people may answer that they haven't had certain experiences that they might have had.
That's correct. It's a little bit tricky.
Yeah.
So do you feel like that's enough on assessment, or should we continue a bit?
Well, that, I think for time's sake, that's a great introduction. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, what we want people to take away most of all is that everybody should be assessing for dissociation in clients.
Right, because I think there are two dangers if you're not assessing. One is the danger of underdiagnosis, like not diagnosing somebody who actually has a dissociative disorder and could be treated for it. Mm-hmm. That's the bigger problem. The smaller problem is that there are lots of therapies now that use ego states. There's EMDR, there is internal family systems therapy, and some others that use this idea of ego states. And it's very important not to overdiagnose people with a dissociative disorder because they have ego states, because they're not quite the same. Everybody's got ego states. Not everybody has dissociative parts, and they can be distinguished from each other. So I think that assessment for both under and over diagnosis is really important.
Yes, thank you. And so the other thing that I hope you could talk about today, I mean, if there was a way in 1 hour to capture all of your knowledge, I'd be a wizard. But, just to get a small taste of what you do.
Right.
if you could talk a little bit about the structural dissociation model, I think it's
Sure.
a great guideline to help therapists understand, why it makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. And I think if I could do anything in this podcast, it is to reassure people that dissociation is understandable, it's rational, it can be worked with in clinical practice with just a little bit of, consultation, supervision, and learning, just like everything else you work with. It's not really bizarre. It is understandable. So I hope that for the next few minutes, I can talk in a way that helps it become more understandable.
Demystify.
Oh, we'll try. Okay. And you really have to sort of unlearn everything you've seen on television about DID, because it's almost all pretty inaccurate, because all of those shows show that parts are 100% completely separate, and the therapist treats them like separate people. And neither of those things should be, well, they're not separate people, and they should never be treated as separate people. You treat the individual as a whole with this fragmented sense of self, so that when I'm working with people, I always say this part of you, this young part of you. So I'm always emphasizing that this is you, and I know it's going to take you a while to get there, but I'll walk that road with you until you can recognize this is also you.
Yeah.
And to really explain dissociation, I think you have to start with normal development in an infant and young child, that we aren't born with an intact sense of self or personality. That's kind of a developmental achievement. And so we don't have a birth personality or a birth core original self. We have little islands of experience that are gradually coalesce over time in the context of a good enough environment. And so if you've ever seen little babies or little children, they switch states very rapidly, and they have lots of dysregulation. And that's what we see in dissociative disorders, sort of abrupt state shifts without a smooth transition and lots of dysregulation. So over time, these kids learn to shift from one state to the other smoothly and kind of within a window of tolerance of regulation. And that's exactly what's missing in these clients, so that we want to help them shift between states in a smooth, kind of coherent way. So the idea of structural dissociation is that in the course of development, we all are driven or directed by what we call motivational or action systems, and attachment is one of them. We are biologically primed to attach to people. So these motivational systems are biological primers in some way. They're evolutionary prepared systems that direct our attention and our perception, our emotion towards certain things and away from others. So that attachment directs us toward connecting to other people. And we have to be in a certain physiological state in order to do that. We have to be in a good regulated state to truly securely attach. But there are other systems that we have that are inborn that protect us from danger. And the most common two that we all know are the two called flight and fight. We all know flight and fight. That's the sympathetic nervous system that activates us to move away from danger or to fight and get it away from us. There are some others. There's freeze and there's faint, which is what the deer or the gazelle does when the lion first grabs it. It just goes out into a dead faint because that's the most protective. And so a child who's being abused is struggling to be in states in which they can be attached. but they're constantly thrown into states in which they have to defend against threat. And these are totally different parts of our nervous system that are activated when we're under threat or when we're feeling safe and connected. There are different physiological states, there are different mental states. And so this poor child is trying to integrate these really discrepant polar opposite states that not only are mental and emotional, but they're physiological. And so this is where we think these divisions go between these motivational systems that divide between threat and attachment and daily life. One of the motivational systems of daily life is exploration. We're curious. We want to learn about our environment. And anytime these defenses are activated, it sort of quashes or deactivates not only attachment, but also curiosity. And in therapy, attachment and curiosity need to be activated for the therapist for the client to really make headway. And so this is the conundrum in trauma therapy, is to help the client continually move out of those defensive fight, flight, freeze, faint states into more relational, safe, cooperative, and curious states. And so this is what our model really tries to address by addressing the different parts that are organized around these different motivational systems and working with the client as a whole, understanding that each client has a system of parts. And it's not, the idea is not to work with one part at a time. That's not very integrative. But the idea is to work with the whole system to help parts begin to appreciate each other's functions, to collaborate in daily life, to function more as a team, at least as a team, and then gradually as one person. So our process is not at all working with one state or part at a time, but to facilitate the capacity of the client to first communicate between parts and then to cooperate, which gradually leads to integration. So I would say in a nutshell, a really quick nutshell, that's what we do in the treatment of structural dissociation.
Yes, thank you. And of course, it's way more complicated
than a book or two or three.
Exactly.
But I think when people can really understand the basic concept of how this develops and that it's not really separate people living in one body, then we can make some headway into really understanding in a rational way how to work with it.
Yes. I think that for me, it's very helpful. It's like an anchor to be able to observe how parts and how feelings that are coming up, states, body sensations can be connected to particular action systems, like you said, trauma defenses. It's like, if the person is yelling at other people or they're, having a lot of conflicts in their relationships, it's easy to notice that could be a fight part,
Could be. It's possible.
Yeah. And I'm sure that depending on how it's all happening, there could be other ways that it could be described as well with the different action systems.
Right. Yeah. And I think the importance there is really understanding for that particular client, is it a fight part? Do they have a dissociative disorder? In which case you have to build some communication and cooperation toward that part. Or is it more like an ego state where the person drops into a fight position and still has a sense of this is me, but the treatment is sort of this underlying the same, but you're adding in the addition, if it's a fight part in a dissociative client, you're adding this increasing collaboration and communication internally among parts.
Yeah. For me, that's That's the most complicated part of the work.
Yes, it is. And I think there's some ways to really work with that in a sort of spiral, gentle way to build these integrative group bridges between parts. I mean, that's far more than we can talk about here, but there are some rational ways that use basic psychotherapy principles that we all know to be able to make that happen. So it's just important for people to know that is a good possibility.
Yes. So in the time we have left, what would you like people to take away from this, from hearing what you had to say?
Number one, that this is a common problem, particularly among people who have early developmental trauma, and that is much of the mental health population we see. Number two, it's important to go get training somewhere on assessing dissociation. I think it's very important to understand dissociation from a rational perspective, not from this hyped up perspective of different people inside, because it really doesn't help our clients to think in those terms. And if you have a client that you suspect might be dissociative, get good consultation. There are tons of great trauma therapists who do great consultation, who can help you take your first steps with a dissociative disorder client. And then you'll be able to realize, oh, you too can do this work. And it's not so terribly different from the work that you do with other complicated trauma survivors, and that it's doable in your own private practice or in your own agency. So I guess those are the big takeaway things.
Yeah, and that's a very, hopeful message, because I think we can be, those sensationalized portrayals that we were talking about can definitely scare the general public and professionals who would be working with people who have dissociative disorders into thinking that this is something, I should fear, instead of this is something that's common among probably many of the people I work with. And if I can help them to get an accurate diagnosis, they can get the right kind of help and become more integrated and feel much better.
Right. And it not only induces fear, it induces skepticism, like, oh, that can't be possible, that somebody has 100 personalities. Well, that's true. They don't really have 100 personalities. They have one that's kind of fragmented. So I think understanding it and not being afraid of it kind of reduces our skepticism too, which is also important.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, almost two sides of the coin, fear or dismissal. Dismissiveness, yeah.
Which is sort of the trauma conflict, isn't it? I'm going to avoid it, or I'm going to be overwhelmed by it.
Yes.
I'm going to deny it happened, or I'm going to be overwhelmed by it. So it's interesting that we have these sort of repetitions of the trauma everywhere we turn.
Boy, isn't that true? Metaphors for how trauma is in our lives are everywhere.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. But I think that, when we can be curious with a client about what is it like to be you, without making a judgment on it, and just being curious about that client's experience and say, tell me more about it, then clients are going to tell you what's going on with them, whether it's dissociation or anything else. So my goal with my clients and with my consultees is always to be curious and compassionate. If I can hold those two things, then I feel like I've had a good day.
That's a pretty good general rule for all of us in the helping professions.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, Kathy, thank you so much for coming here to talk about this today. I'm very grateful for your time and your immense knowledge and wisdom on this topic, and how you're able to really put it into clear, understandable language as well.
Thanks. I hope I've been able to do that. That's my goal, and people are certainly invited to contact me if they have questions.
Yes. So whether they are wanting to ask you a question about our discussion or get consultation or find training, where can people find you?
The best way to find me actually is on my website, which is www.kathy, Kathy-Steele, Steele. So Kathy-Steele.com. And I have my trainings up there, my publications. You can contact me for consultation there. So that's the best way to contact me.
Wonderful. And would people find your books there as well?
Yes, there are some direct links to Amazon, so you can go right on there. My articles and book chapters, as many of them as are possible to put up there because of copyright laws, I have links to those that you can download them and read them too.
Ooh, wonderful. Well, thank you again. I will put a link to your website in the show notes for this episode, and I just can't thank you enough for taking the time to be on Therapy Chat today.
Well, I really appreciate you having me, Laura. Thank you very much.
Let's pause for just a minute so I can tell you a little bit more about why I love therapy notes. Hey, it's Laura Reagan. Just wanted to give you a little bit more information about therapy notes. So, as you probably know, I run a group trauma therapy practice. I have a total of 7 clinicians working with me, and I've been using therapy notes ever since I expanded into a group, which is almost 3 years ago. Well, 2.5. As my practice has grown, therapy notes has been an easy, intuitive practice management system for us to use for billing, scheduling, documentation, and adding staff has been easy. One of the things I'm really grateful for is the fact that they have a discounted rate for interns. So even my 2 interns can use therapy notes without it adding a lot of extra expense for the practice, since as interns, they don't bring in much, if any, money. So if you're a therapist, whether you are a solo practitioner or a group practice owner, try out therapy notes. You can get a 2-month free trial by using the code TherapyChat. I think you'll find, compared to other practice management systems, it's the best one out there. At least that's what I think. Now let's get back to our episode. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. Today, I have a very interesting and exciting guest to share with you, and we are going to talk about a subject that I'm completely fascinated with. My guest today is Dick Schwartz, PhD, the founding developer of Internal Family Systems. Dick, thank you so much for being on Therapy Chat today.
Happy to do it, Laura. Happy to talk with you.
Thank you. I'm really happy. Let's just start off by, if you would, you telling our audience a bit about yourself and your work.
Okay. I'm a pretty old man, 58 now. And so this goes back when I was in my early 30s. I had just graduated from a PhD program in marital and family therapy. So that's my background as a family therapist. And as such, I was steeped in systems thinking, and I was also one of those zealous family therapists who thought we discovered the Holy Grail, and that those individual therapists that were mucking around in the intrapsyche were wasting their time because we could change all that just by changing these external relationships. At some point, I think it was like 1982 or 3, a colleague, Mary Jo Barrett, and I started an outcome study to prove this. And we gathered together about 30 bulimic kids and their families, and went ahead and reorganized the families just the way the book said to do it. And many of my clients didn't realize they'd been cured, and they kept binging and purging. And so out of frustration, I began asking what was going on, and they started talking about these different parts of them. And they were talking, that was the word they used, and they were talking about them as if they had a lot of autonomy and that they could take over their psyche and make them do things that they didn't want to do and make them feel terrible. And they talked about how they would fight with each other inside. And so at first I got scared. I thought, oh my God, I've got a collection of multiple personality clients was the term back then. And but I got curious and just started asking more and more questions about how they all related to each other. And you know, it did sound familiar to me as a family therapist. It sounded like this inner system or even an inner family. And so then I got intrigued, and I also noticed that I had them too, and some of mine were as extreme about food as theirs. So basically, I got out of that scared place and became curious and learned this whole model from these clients in the early days. And then there was a time when I thought these things must be what the field thought they were. So the critic, for example, would be a internalized parental voice, or the binge would be some kind of out of control impulse. And so I was trying to get my clients to control them or not let them take over and to fight with them. And that was making my clients worse, but I didn't know what else to do given that I thought of these things that way. And so it wasn't until the first client I was aware of that had an extensive sex abuse history and also cut herself that all this changed, because I was trying to get the cutting part to stop. And by then I learned about the Gestalt empty chair technique, where you would have a client imagine that there was a part sitting across from them in an empty chair, and then you could have them move into that chair and be the part, and you'd have these kind of dialogues. And so I would have my client just telling that cutting part that it couldn't do it anymore, and I would be saying that in a kind of coercive way. And so then finally the part agreed not to cut her one session. And of course I opened the door to the next session and she has a big gash down the side of her face. And at that point I collapsed and I just said, I give up, I can't beat you, to the part. And it said, well, I don't really want to beat you. And that was a kind of historic turning point in the development of this, because I shifted out of that coercive place to just being curious and said, well, then why do you do this to her? And the cutting part, talked about how it had to do that when she was being abused to get her out of her body and to contain the rage that would get her more abused. And then I shifted again, now not just curious, but I have a kind of deep appreciation for the heroic role the part had played in her life. And I convey that to the part and have her do that. And the part burst into tears because everybody had been trying to get rid of it and fight with it and had demonized it. And finally somebody was listening to it and began to talk about how it still needed to protect these very vulnerable parts that were still there. And it saw the world as very scary. And as I got all that, it sounded like this part wasn't living in the present, like it was still stuck back in the abuse time. And so it occurred to me that maybe these parts are like kids in a family. Like family therapy's big insight was that you can't take a kid out of a family and tell them to just stop acting out. You have to understand the role that the child is playing in the family system and how all these other relationships have to change before the child would be freed up to change. Maybe the same thing was happening with these parts. And indeed, that's panned out to be the case these 30-some years later. So when I got hip to that these parts aren't what they seemed, and in fact, our like children had been forced into roles they didn't even like, I started to shift, and I tried to get my clients to get to know them instead of fighting with them, and actually update them about how they aren't so vulnerable now and so on. So with all of that, I came to suddenly realize that maybe none of these parts are what they seem. Even the ones that seem so destructive are just trying their best to keep the system safe. And now, 30-some years later, and thousands of people using this around the world, pretty safely can say that that's true, that there aren't any bad ones. And I'm sort of the real Will Rogers of the phenomenon. I've never met a part that ultimately I didn't like. So that's kind of a radical view in our field. It takes me back to the basic assumption, which is that the natural state of the mind is to be multiple, such that people with DID, or multiple personality disorder, aren't so different from you and me, except the horrific abuse they suffered blew their system apart. So there's a lot of amnesic barriers and compartmentalization, such that parts don't have that much contact with each other, and they're very polarized with each other. But the idea that theirs are full range altered personalities, for me, is no different. That it's the natural state of the mind to be born with these alters or parts or ego states or sub-personalities. A lot of different names for them. And virtually anybody who's done inner exploration has run into them. And that they're, unlike the trauma field, and many people in the trauma field who believe that they're the split off sort of remnants or pieces of the unitary mind. They're not the product of trauma. Their extremeness is a product of trauma. The role they're in is a product of trauma often. But they come with us into life. So, and again, that's kind of a radical position in our field. So I'll pause here and just see how this sits with you.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to sort of put a frame around what you were just saying, that the different parts aren't there because of trauma, but maybe the trauma is the reason why a person would be unaware of the parts, some of the parts, like why there's an amnesia about some of the parts.
Yeah. So some of the effect of trauma, let's say you're in a single parent family. You're a child in a single parent family, and an intruder breaks into your house, and your single parent, maybe your mother, kind of abdicated and hid or something, and you had to deal with the intruder.
Mm-hmm.
So now you don't trust your parents' leadership anymore, and you become what in family therapy is called a parentified child. And you now have a lot of extreme beliefs and emotions that entered your system because of this, all of this. And that's pretty much what happens with these inner systems when you're traumatized, especially when you're a child. There are parts that push what I'm going to call self out of the way, and I'll talk about self in a minute, and then take on these managerial parental roles inside and get stuck in that role because of what happened. And they carry a lot of what I call burdens from the experience, which are definition, which is an extreme belief and emotion that came into your system from a trauma or from an attachment injury. So it's all, for me, it's all very parallel to external families.
I see. So the roles that the family members play and the children play in a family, as you said before, in an external family, are the same types of roles that are divided up inside of us in our internal family.
Yeah, well, these parts find themselves, it isn't their nature, it's not their naturally what they're designed to be, but they find themselves forced out of their naturally valuable states into these roles that, as I say, sometimes are quite destructive. And they're frozen in time. They're stuck back in the time of the trauma, and they carry these extreme beliefs and emotions from it. And all of that maintains them in these extreme, often protective roles. And then there are other parts, often the ones who are the most hurt by the trauma, which are these, what commonly are called these inner children, young parts, who are the most sensitive parts of you, who often are the most hurt by the trauma. So what initially seemed like a playful, loving, creative, happy inner child that you loved having access to, once it gets hurt, it's not so much fun to be around, because now it carries a lot of the terror or the shame or the pain, the loneliness, betrayal from the trauma. And so now you don't want to be around it. You tend to lock it in some kind of an inner container inside, and it becomes what we call an exile. And you think you're just locking up memories, sensations, emotions, and beliefs. You don't realize you're actually locking up your juice, because now it seems contaminated with all these burdens. So, and when you have a lot of exiles, you as a person feel much, much more vulnerable in the world. And so then other parts have to be much, much more protective. So that's the main distinction in this model between these vulnerable exiles who you're struggling to keep from being triggered again so that nothing similar to the original trauma happens to you. And also you're struggling to keep them contained so they don't overwhelm you, they don't break out, and you're not flooded by all those flames of emotion. And then these protectors whose job it is to contain all the exiles and to protect them from being triggered.
Okay, I got it. So I just want to go back for a second, because there was so much in what you said in your first few minutes of talking about the difference in the way of working with behaviors that a client or us in our lives may exhibit, like cutting or binging, self-destructive behaviors. The difference from struggling with them, trying to control them, to seeing them as adaptive and seeing them as having a positive intention.
Yeah, actually seeing them as heroic. So
yeah, appreciating them. Yeah.
Honoring them almost like you would a serviceman, a Marine or something, because they took on a role that you needed at the time, and then they're kind of stuck there.
Yeah, and that idea of seeing eating disordered behavior as heroic, it's just so counter to the way it's seen in our culture and the way we as therapists typically relate to it in therapy work.
Yeah. So everybody is all about, let's defeat Ed, eating disorder.
Yeah.
Most of the treatment centers around the country subscribe to this. And it's a big problem, because Ed will kick your ass. The reason the death rate for anorexia is so high is because everybody's trying to fight the anorexic part. And it will kill you as it tries to fight for its ability to protect you. It's kind of ironic. So we go to parts just to listen to how they got into their roles and learn about what they protect and honor them for trying to keep you safe when you were young, which is almost always the case. And when you approach them this way, instead of trying to get rid of them or shame them into stopping, they relax and they don't fight. And they're like the cutting part that bursts into tears often. And they'll share what I call their secret history of how they got forced into the role they were in. And then we can set about negotiating with them to go to what they protect so we can actually heal that, which would then liberate them from these roles they're in. And some of that negotiation would go something like, to an anorexic part, if we could heal the parts of you that you're trying to keep her away from or protect in some way, so that you didn't have to do this job, what might you like to do instead? And you'd be amazed at the answers to that question.
Wow. That's such a different way. Like you were saying, it's a pretty radical difference from the way that people often practice with these safety contracts and promising not to do certain things. And
yeah, and we do the same thing with suicide. So, yeah, it's quite radical.
But IFS is an evidence-based practice. So, and as you've said, thousands of people are using it around the world. So it actually works.
It actually works a lot better. Trust me. It's a lot easier on the therapist because it's no fun to constantly wrestle and lose all these battles with these scary parts.
Yeah, and it's really not fun for the client either to have the shame and disappointment in wanting to comply with what the therapist is asking, and for some reason that they don't understand, they aren't able to.
That's right. And that's what happens. Either you get what in the addictions field is called a white knuckle recovery, where certain parts totally take over the person's personality and lock up the addictive part or the cutting part or the suicidal part. But that takes a lot of energy to keep all that contained. And so people get kind of rigid to do it. So this doesn't involve any of that. In fact, let me talk about another aspect of the model I haven't mentioned yet, or I did mention, but deserves further. So as I was doing all this back in the day, and I would try to have, now that I know these parts aren't what they seem, and I was trying to get my client to get along with them and listen to them and help them out of their roles. And I would be having those kind of dialogues. I'm a relationship therapist. I'm a family therapist. So I'm having my client talk to maybe a critic inside or a cutting part or some part like that. But my client would be suddenly getting angry at the part as we would do this. And it reminded me of family sessions where I might be talking or trying to have a teenage girl talk to her critical mother, for example. And all of a sudden the girl is getting angry at the mother. And we were taught to look around the room and see if somebody isn't covertly siding with the girl against the mother. And often you'd find the father is doing that. And when you ask the father to step back out of her line of vision, things would settle down and they'd have a better conversation. So it occurred to me, maybe the same thing's happening in this inner system as I'm trying to have my client talk to this extreme part in a relational way. Maybe another part is interfering. And so I would ask clients, could you find the one who hates the critic and ask it to step back? Basically the same thing I was doing with families. And they'd say, okay, it did, to my amazement. I'd say, now how do you feel toward this critic? It would be entirely different. Sometimes equally extreme. Sometimes now I'm afraid of it. But we also ask the fear to step back. At some point, suddenly, spontaneously, and universally, they would enter what now is called a mindful state, where they would say, I'm calm, and I'm just kind of curious about why it's doing what it's doing. And they would seem confident relative to it. And from that place, the conversation with the part would go very well. And when I started asking clients, now what part of you is that? They'd say that's not really a part like these others. That's more myself or my core self, my true self. That's more of who I am. So I came to call that the self with a capital S to distinguish it from the common usage of the word self, which means the whole personality. And it turns out, again, 30 some years later, thousands of people doing this, that core, that essence, that self is in everybody, even the most severely diagnosed clients with the most horrible histories. And it can't be damaged. And it can be accessed much more quickly than people thought, simply by getting these protective parts to open space for it inside. Now, sometimes that takes some negotiation, but it's just beneath the surface of these these intense protective parts. And when it emerges, it comes forward in sort of the same way in everybody with these wonderful, what we call C-word qualities, like curiosity and calm and confidence and compassion even for parts they've been fighting with all their lives, or creativity and how they relate to the parts, or courage, enough courage to go to these exiles that they've been terrified of, and a sense of feeling connected to the parts and to humanity in general. So this has become the centerpiece of the model, this conviction that that self, as I said, can't be damaged and is in everybody, even clients where you would, based on traditional psychology, you would think would not have any business having any of those qualities, because attachment theory has said that to have any of that, you had to have had a certain kind of parenting during a critical period in your childhood. And I'm talking about clients that were tortured on a daily basis. There's no way they got it from either of their parents. So at some point I had to conclude, this is just in us. It's our birthright. It's not something, contrary to attachment theory, it's not something that has to come in relationship. And that's also quite a radical position.
Well, it is, to me, it is new because my orientation is towards more of an attachment theory, but it's also like good news because there are some people who didn't get that, and to think that, you know, it, as a human being and what my personal values and beliefs are, it's really hard for me to square the idea that there's anybody who doesn't have humanity inside of them, you know? And, you know, to believe that under some circumstances, you know, the most extreme cases of abuse, that some people would not have that doesn't sit right for me.
Yes, and it's also good news for the therapist, because you don't have to become that good attachment figure for the client. IFS is often thought of as attachment theory taken inside, so that what I'm calling self becomes the good attachment figure to the parts, some of whom are insecurely attached, and some are avoidantly, and some are blocking on the third one.
Disorganized?
Anyway, disorganized. So they all start to look to the client's self rather than the therapist, rather than their partner, for security, for connection. And self becomes like an inner good parent.
Again, that's reassuring for the therapist, and I'm sure for the client, that you have within you what you need. You just need someone to help you find it, and then you do the rest.
Yeah, and it's a tough sell for a lot of trauma clients because they haven't had any access to that virtually all their lives. So they'll say, their parts will say, there's nobody like that inside of me, or that died back when I was being abused. But it turns out not to be true. And if I can convince them to open enough space, it always shows up.
Yeah. So I have seen IFS therapists work with people who have had no training in parts work, and help them access the different parts and self so quickly. It's pretty amazing to see.
It is quite remarkable. It turns out that we've kind of been socialized away from our multiplicity, partly because of the trauma field. You know, multiplicity has been pathologized by movies like Sybil, and, it's seen as pathology.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of fear of even acknowledging it. And so that's part of what I've been up against all these years. Just finished a book on this topic where we looked through the whole history of the way multiplicity has been viewed, and how there were many times that people said, no, it's natural, the mind to be multiple. And then many people just shut all that down, both in the culture and in psychotherapy. And so I'm trying to revive this idea now. So that it's actually healthy. The mind, one mind can't do everything we have to do. It takes a village. And so it's great to have all these different parts. They're not pathological. They can be pathological when they're forced out of their naturally valuable states.
So what I've been taught, and I want to make sure that this is the same way that you're seeing it, or if not, learn more from you, is that there's nothing wrong with us having all these different parts, but the pathology is about the parts not being integrated into a whole.
Yes and no. So that is the position of the field when you think of a whole as the disappearance of the parts into one mind, right? Mm. And that's the DID position.
Okay.
My position is a kind of yes and no. It's integrating parts, but not so that they disappear and you just have one mind. It's bringing them all back home so they trust self-leadership, which, as I said, can take some time, and so that they're liberated from their roles, their extreme roles they've been forced into. They've been unburdened. They've released the extreme beliefs and emotions they carry, and they now start to harmonize with each other. And when that happens, when they start to get to know each other and find different ways to relate, you feel much more unitary. You hardly notice your parts because they're all working together. They don't stand out the way they used to. But they don't disappear. The analogy I often make is to a flock of birds. If we looked out a window today and saw a big flock of birds, they'd be moving as if they were one organism. But you could still pull a bird out of the flock and would have autonomy. So that's what we're shooting for with these parts. So yeah, part of the pathologizing of parts is to say they're the product of trauma. They're a split off thing that needs to be put back together like Humpty Dumpty.
Okay. So I think the way you're talking about it is the way I see it, because I've been taught that, but not the way that it's always viewed, because I think the way I'm saying integration is that all the parts are valued as part of what makes the whole what it is, rather than certain parts aren't allowed to be there, because then you're not integrated in the way I was taught.
Yeah. So that's I agree with that.
Thank you for explaining that distinction, because I think, there are a lot of public perceptions about multiplicity. Like you said, the movie Sybil, I think that did, really scare so many people.
Yeah, there's a new movie called Split. I don't know if you saw it, but it's the same. The DID client is a murderer, and, it just makes it all look real scary and bad.
Right. And I know that not everyone who can benefit from IFS has trauma, because as you say, everyone has parts of themselves. But can you talk about who IFS can help? And then I'd also be interested in how it can help people who have trauma.
Well, we work with virtually every diagnosis. So we work with schizophrenia. We work with DID quite a bit. We work, most anything you can think of. So there are contraindications, but they have nothing to do with diagnosis. It's much more about, is the external context of the client safe enough to do this kind of work? Or are you going to be able to hold what I call self-energy as a therapist? Or are you going to get triggered by something about them, which makes it dangerous to the client? But we work with virtually every diagnosis you can think of this way.
So from someone who just feels a little bit worried about something to someone who has whatever the most extreme types of symptoms would be.
Yeah, and symptoms are generally the activities of protective parts. So if I'm working with a client and they suddenly dissociate, I don't try to, quote unquote, ground them with grounding skills, where you say, look into my eyes and breathe and feel your feet on the floor. Because that gives the message to the part who's trying to take them out that it shouldn't be doing that. It doesn't belong here. It needs to leave. So instead, if I was working with you, Laura, and you suddenly dissociated, I'd say, oh, I see a part just took you out. Can I talk to it directly for a second? And then I'd say, okay, so are you the part of Laura that just took her out? And the part would say yes, or you might just shake your head. And we'd have a conversation about it. Say, okay, why did you do that? What are you afraid would happen if you let her stay in her body? And they usually have pretty good reasons for taking you out. Often it's because they're afraid of the emotion that's coming up and afraid you can't handle it. And most of these parts, this is amazing. If anybody wants to just try this, if I were to ask that part how old it thought you were, most of the time I get a single digit, because there's frozen back when you were 9 years old and you couldn't protect yourself, and they did have to take you away from these emotions because you wouldn't have been able to handle them. And so just updating them, just letting you know I'm not 9 anymore and I'm not living there, it helps a lot of these even highly symptomatic parts relax a lot.
So in that example, does the therapist let the part know how old the person is, or does the person, the client, tell the other part?
Yeah, ideally, I would have that conversation, and I would say, would you be willing to hear from Laura how old she is? And then I would say, okay, let me talk to you again, Laura. And then I would say to you, how do you feel toward this part as you heard that conversation I had with it? And ideally, you would have some access to self, and you'd say, oh, I feel some compassion for it because I see it's really desperately trying to protect what it thinks is a little girl. I said, well, let it know that, and do let it know how old you really are, and just see how it reacts. And a lot of times, these parts are totally astounded. And I've had it where people had to go and get a newspaper and show them what the real date is because they just couldn't believe that you've grown up.
That's so amazing. And I saw that in a training. I saw, and the person who the trainer was working with, one of the participants, and the person did not have any dissociative disorder or anything, but when they told their part how old they are, and then they listened to what the part said internally without talking out loud, they said that the part didn't know that,
Yes, really, really common, because they're all frozen in time at the time of the trauma, and they live back there. And so a lot of the healing work is going to these parts with an open mind and asking them to show what happened and how bad it was, where they're stuck in the past. And once they feel fully witnessed, then I would have you as yourself, Laura, enter that scene and be with often that little girl in the way she needed back there. And we would do that until the girl felt like she was ready to leave with you, felt connected to you, and then we would take her to a safe, comfortable place. Sometimes in the present, sometimes a fantasy place, sometimes a different time in your life. At which point, that little girl would be ready to unload the feelings and beliefs she got from the trauma. And so that we have a little bit of a ritualized process for doing that. And as soon as all that's out of her body, immediately she would become a playful little girl and would want to go play probably. And it seems miraculous, but it really can happen that quickly. And before we had her go play, we'd bring in all these protectors to see that she's okay and they don't need to protect her anymore. And that begins that integration process where they now are freed up to leave their extreme roles and be much more of who they're designed to be.
Wow. Really powerful. And I don't have IFS training yet, but the parts work training I've had that incorporated your teachings in a smaller way through Lisa Ferrance it's the most, I don't know, it's an incredibly impactful type of work to do with clients and also for ourselves as clinicians, even in learning experientially. You realize how many parts of yourself you exile.
Yeah. So a big part of our training is helping therapists learn about their protectors and their exiles, so that what's called countertransference, where, you're with a client and suddenly you feel something extreme. So in the moment, you can kind of notice, oh, okay, here's that protective part that's come up. I'm just going to ask it to give me some space so I can get my heart back open and my mind back open. And you'll feel this as it separates, you'll feel an immediate shift in those directions. And then you follow up afterwards and you check with the part about why it got so triggered, and maybe even trade sessions with somebody so that you can work on what it's protecting so it doesn't keep getting triggered by the same client or by the same situation. So when you can do that, your clients become what I call your tormentors, with a hyphen between the tor and the mentor, because by triggering you, they're mentoring you about what you need to heal.
And we all have stuff we need to heal. Yeah,
and most people who are attracted to becoming trauma therapists have some trauma themselves. So when your client is with, let's say, a very vulnerable, hurting, young part of them, and they're showing a lot of that, it's going to start to trigger those parts of you that were hurt in a similar way. And if you don't have a good relationship with those parts of you, then all your protectors are going to rush in and interfere. So, there's no getting away with not doing your own trauma work to be able to stay present with trauma clients.
So true. And one thing Lisa taught us in the training is that you can't tell that part of yourself just to step aside and promise to come back and then not come back to it.
Right. Yeah, it's all very real. You have to take this all very seriously as an inner family, because it's just like telling a kid in a family you're going to do something for them and then forgetting. It's the same process.
It's a beautiful model, and I love the concept of self with a capital S and the compassion, curiosity, calm, confidence, creativity, courage, and connection. So beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a tough sell, as you can imagine, because so many, especially trauma folks, believe that trauma wipes all that out. I've had these debates, for example, with Bessel van der Kolk, where he'll show a slide of an MRI of a trauma survivor where their prefrontal cortex is totally dark. They're not lit up at all. And he'll say, this is what we're dealing with. And so we have to teach these people all these affect regulation skills and all these skills because they don't have a prefrontal cortex that's on. And I'll say, no, that's not true. That's what they look like when a protector takes over and dissociates or takes their prefrontal cortex out. But as soon as that part relaxes, it'll light up again. And so he said, prove it. So we're actually trying to do that.
Wow. Bessel van der Kolk, if you're listening and you would like to come on and dispute this, please contact me.
Anytime.
That's so amazing. I just love that you said that, because all the things we've learned and, we're like integrating the information that we've learned. And Bessel van der Kolk is someone I greatly admire and certainly have learned a ton from his books and his trainings and talks and stuff. Yeah.
Well, I make that very clear. He has really almost single-handedly created this field and has done a great job of alerting people to the impact of trauma. And he's a close friend.
Yes. I mean, it would be to see someone like you and someone like him having that kind of discussion is just, it's like a dream come true for someone who's fascinated with trauma. So I love, it's such an exciting time. It's so positive, all the good work that's out there. Gosh, I'm just really happy about it.
Same here.
Thank you so much for all of your contributions to this field. It's incredible what you've done, and it's I'm so deeply honored that you took the time to be on Therapy Chat today. I wish I could talk with you for another hour or so, but I know we can't. But
I really enjoyed it too, Laura, so you're a good interviewer.
Oh, thanks. Where can people who either want to learn IFS or want to find an IFS therapist or read your books and hear more about what you're doing, where can they find you?
So our website is selfleadership.org, and on there they can learn about what we call level 1 trainings, which are either 6 3-day weekends spread over a course of a year or 2 6-day blocks with some online stuff. And so that's one of the entry points. The other one is what's called the Online Circle, which is obviously an online subscription program that teaches the basics, particularly for people that can't get to one of these training programs. And all of that is listed on the website, as is a directory of therapists all over the world, really. And the store, which has all the books and videos and so on, too.
Wonderful. Well, Dick, thank you again so much for being my guest today on Therapy Chat. I can't wait for our audience to hear this and eat it all up.
You're very welcome, Laura. It was a pleasure.
Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat, 2018 edition. Happy New Year to all of you. I know I did a very brief New Year's greeting to you a couple weeks ago. Maybe it was last week, but it's now fully in 2018 and I'm back in action. Still kind of recovering from a cold, but hopefully my voice sounds good enough for you that you can hear and understand what I'm saying. So today I wanted to talk as a follow-up to episode 117 with Dr. Dick Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems, IFS. I thoroughly enjoyed interviewing him. He is super knowledgeable, and I am so honored that he took the time to come on Therapy Chat. And our conversation may have been a little more geared towards a level of professionals who work in the mental health field and know a lot about IFS already, or something about IFS and parts work. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about parts work today in a more general way and give you some resources. I didn't know what parts work was until about, I guess it was 2014 or so, maybe 2015. I think I was starting to hear about it in 2014, learned more in 2015, and that's when I did my advanced postgraduate trauma certificate training, where I was trained in using parts work. IFS and parts work are not necessarily the same, but the type of parts work that I learned was informed by IFS, Internal Family Systems. So I want to start this discussion of parts work by reading you a poem by Rumi called The Guest House. Some of you may have heard this before. I think this poem is a really wonderful representation of the concept of all parts are welcome, which is the way I learned about parts work. Here's the poem, The Guest House by Rumi. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. That is The Guest House by Rumi, R-U-M-I. So when I was doing the trauma certificate program that you have heard me talk about through the Ferentz Institute. That's Ferentz, Lisa Ferentz's Institute, the Ferentz Institute in Baltimore. And the reason I'm going over that over and over is because people constantly ask me what are the best places to get training in advanced techniques for use with working with people who have trauma. And the Ferentz Institute is a wonderful place. You may not be able to get to Baltimore, and if so, there are some other good places too that I frequently recommend, but that is one that is amazing, and I'm so fortunate that Lisa Ferentz is right in Baltimore, and I've been privileged to learn from her. So when I was doing the Advanced Trauma Certificate at the Ferentz Institute, it's a highly experiential program, and it consists of multiple days over a 4-month period, I believe. So it's a total of 54 credit hours of learning. And highly experiential meaning we're practicing the techniques that we are learning to use so that we can use them with clients. And what I learned in this program is that we all have different parts of ourselves. It may be your inner critic that tells you you're a stupid idiot whenever you make a mistake. It may be the part of you that loves chocolate, and there may be a part of you that loves animals. There may be a part of you that screams and yells when you get upset. Part of you that is mad at your mom. Part of you that is afraid of your mom. A part of you that is worried about your mom. All these different parts that we have, it's kind of like feelings that have gotten compartmentalized because we don't always know how to handle them. So the concept of parts work is that we all have these different parts of ourselves. Some parts we like about ourselves and some parts we don't like about ourselves. And maybe some parts of ourselves that we aren't aware of, which you heard in my interviews with Rini Beck, Lourdes Viado, and the first interview, actually the second interview with Carrie Nola. I'll put the links to those in the show notes. But in those discussions about the shadow, that concept goes along with parts work as well. It's that there are parts of ourselves that we don't like and we don't think about, and we may not even have them in our conscious awareness. And, you know, it's those parts that sometimes cause us to act out in ways, and then we wonder why we did what we did. There may be a part that cuts, a part that binges. And so that's one of the things that Dick Schwartz was talking about, is he was giving the example of when he was working in a psychiatric hospital with a client who was cutting, and what he knew to do as a therapist was to tell her not to cut and get her to promise she wouldn't cut. But what he didn't realize was that the part of her that was making her cut was not really in her awareness when she was promising not to cut. So maybe it was, maybe it wasn't in her awareness, but when the part of her that wanted to cut was more present than the part of her that had promised not to cut, and there was a reason why that part needed to be there to help her cope with something, an overwhelming emotion that she couldn't handle. The power struggle that he got into with that part, saying, you know, telling her not to cut, didn't take into account that that part was trying to do something to help her. And so when he realized that there was a different part of her that he hadn't been reaching when he was trying to tell her not to cut, he realized he needed to stop fighting with that part and try to understand it and understand why it was making her do this behavior that was hurting her. I think we can all relate to the idea that, you know, there's a part of me that really wants a piece of German chocolate cake, but then there's another part of me that knows that I don't need the extra calories, but I really want that cake. There's a part of me that feels I deserve it. There's a part of me that doesn't care about the calories. And then there's a part of me that says, you know, you've been trying to eat healthy. You weren't feeling well. When you eat too much sugar, you know, can you relate to that? Like these different parts competing. That's kind of the idea of parts work. And that's why Dick Schwartz says that multiplicity is not a bad thing. He's saying that we all have these different parts of ourselves. And what we talked about in episode 117 is that for someone who has severe dissociation, where they slip from one part into another part and they don't necessarily know which part they're in at any given time because they're not really connected with all the different parts, that is where the different parts not being connected with one another can cause problems for the person with their functioning and their relationships and doing self-destructive behaviors that may help them in the moment to cope with the way they feel, but also cause them problems. So I wanted to kind of tell you about my experience in the trauma certificate program and learning about parts work, because exiles are a really important part of learning about parts work. I'm not going to explain the whole IFS paradigm, but one of the concepts of IFS is that the parts that we don't accept about ourselves are the exiles. And often, as Dick explained when we were talking in episode 117, often exiles can be parts of ourselves that we are disowning. For example, if someone was abused in childhood, they had many experiences of being terrified, feeling unsafe from the person who they also depended upon for protection, their primary caregiver, a part that may have been disgusted by the things that happened, but was forced to participate. Another part was forced to participate. So the person had to kind of dissociate during that experience. And then to bring that dissociated part back feels disgusting to them. So they can't tolerate feeling the emotions that are connected with that dissociated part, which is all the trauma that they experience that causes this to happen. So going to the idea of exiles, let's say someone was abused. They may have a vulnerable child part that they just feel disgusted by. They can't stand that vulnerability. It feels like weakness. And that weakness reminds them of feelings of powerlessness. Of course, children are powerless, but that's not a flaw. Being an innocent child isn't a bad thing. But to bring that exiled part back means confronting that feeling of powerlessness that's so horrible to remember. So that part gets exiled, and then sometimes that inner child, that hurt, vulnerable part, starts acting out, and the person doesn't really have conscious awareness of when it's happening. And that can be full dissociative episodes where they are in that state of feeling as if they are that child again, and the adult part isn't available or accessible to them. Or it can be more like they still behave as the adult part, but they feel like the child part, and they don't really know what's happening. So the most important part of parts work that has stuck with me and that really made an impact on me personally as I was learning about parts work is the idea that all parts are welcome. Like in that Rumi poem that I read to you at the beginning of this episode. Take all the guests that come and invite them in, even the ones that are bringing feelings that you don't like, because this is the experience of being human. We're made up of all these parts, our sadness, our happiness, our fears, our joy, all of our experiences, all of our emotions, and even the traumatic experiences we've had. And so some of the things that we did in the trauma certificate program are we learned activities to use with clients to help them get to become familiar with their different parts and to embrace all of them, not just tolerate the ones they don't like. And I really should say, not just tolerate the ones we don't like, because I remember one of the activities we were doing, and we were supposed to represent all of the parts using these stickers, all of our parts. And I was looking through the stickers trying to find some that were ugly and unlikable to represent some of the parts of myself that I felt were ugly and unlikable. And Lisa, in her nurturing way, very kindly said, there are no ugly stickers. So all the stickers were pretty, they were sparkly and they were unique shapes and colors. And it helped me to see that even the parts of myself that I didn't like were equally valuable as the ones that I did like. And I'm saying that in the past tense because just doing that activity helped open my eyes to how I did have parts of myself that I really didn't like and didn't welcome or accept about myself, let alone embrace them. And through the process of the trauma certificate program, the experiential practices we had, and the personal growth and therapy work that I did to build on what I learned there have helped me to actually believe that all of the parts of ourselves are valuable. Having that experience, this is why experiential trainings are so valuable, because having that experience of seeing how, as I was identifying the different parts of myself, there were some that I just was like, oh, this one. I felt ashamed. I didn't even want to mention it. I didn't want to put it on the paper. And realizing that helped me to recognize how vulnerable it is for our clients to talk about those parts of themselves that they don't like, and how, the painful feelings that can come up when you even try to think about it. So parts work is really incredible. And what you may have heard in the interview with Dick Schwartz, I was definitely hearing the beautiful, compassionate perspective that it brings. And I mean, compassion, when you feel it, when you experience it, either towards someone else or when you feel it from someone else, it's an incredibly powerful, beautiful energy. And in parts work, you are being compassionate for all of the parts of yourself. So instead of saying to that part that makes you cut, I hate you and I want you to go away, you're saying, I understand that you've been trying to help me and you did help me get through some horrible things. And thank you for what you did to help me and how you helped me get through. And I'm going to find some ways to deal with my emotions that don't cause me pain, and you don't have to do that job anymore. That's very compassionate, because you're basically saying to a part that developed through something horrible that you were going through, you're saying, you're not bad. I care about you. It's like saying to yourself, the feelings that you had were not wrong, and it's like seeing the goodness in yourself all the way through, even in the things that you might regret, that you may have done to hurt yourself. When you can give yourself that compassion, you have more compassion for other people. And so another thing I wanted to talk about, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit in episode 117, that when I went to the Life Force Yoga and IFS training last spring in Massachusetts, and I talked about going to it, but I never talked about attending, I don't think. This was a 3-day training where the instructors were both Life Force Yoga certified and IFS certified. And over the 3 days, totally experientially, they taught us how the two methods can be used together. And so basically Life Force Yoga involves breathing techniques, mudras, hand positions of yoga, yoga theory, and breath work and movement, and incorporating the practices of IFS, helping people to get in touch with the different parts, and Life Force Yoga, using that to attend to some of the emotions that come up when the different parts are accessed. This training, I have never felt so zen as I did when I attended this training. We were doing yoga. I think we were doing it twice a day for 3 days. Maybe one of the days we only did it once. I think we did 5 times in the 3 days. And using the breathing techniques and guided meditations, I felt so not just relaxed, but centered, really centered. I had walked in there on the first day after getting up for my flight at like 4 a.m. Walked in. We were kind of late. I was super rattled. I'd been really stressed about something in my personal life and showed up at 8:30. By noon, when we broke for lunch, I was like, just practically sitting there like, My dog didn't like that sound. She jumped up. I was beyond comfortable. I was just completely like in a Zen place. I was feeling all the love. It was so great. And it maintained through the whole 3 days of the training and after I got back. So one of the things that I saw in the IFS training, the Life Force Yoga and IFS training, is that when some audience members or when some participants in the training volunteered to be part of a demo and the leaders talked to them about their different parts, even people who had absolutely no training in IFS, this was the first time they were ever learning about it, were able to access some of the different parts when they got into a mindful space. And one of the things that it showed me was that what Dick Schwartz says about multiplicity being normal is very true, that everybody had different parts of themselves that were both in their conscious awareness and not. And with the guidance of the leaders, everyone was able to access these different parts and to talk with the parts and relieve and shift some burdens that they had been carrying, emotional burdens. It was really powerful and it was incredible because it was in a very short time too. It was like a 5 or 10 minute demo. So this is something that I now use in some way with practically every client I work with. Not necessarily every client I work with has severe dissociation, but everyone can benefit from getting in touch with the different parts of themselves and accepting and embracing all of our different parts, recognizing the value that each part brings. So what we learn to do in the trauma certificate program is to use mindfulness techniques and guided visualizations, helping clients get into a mindful space and helping clients to learn to recognize the different parts of themselves and to embrace that idea that all parts are welcome. And then using various expressive arts techniques to connect with the parts and help to relieve some of the burdens that the different parts carry and find more self-compassion. It was very powerful. So I am a huge believer in parts work. I still plan to do IFS training at some point, although the one I was thinking of doing this year in Washington, D.C. is already full, and it's actually not feasible for me to do it this year anyway, even if it weren't full, because I'm doing sensory motor psychotherapy level 2 starting next month. And that's one weekend. It's not every month, but it's for, is it 10 months? I think, no, it's 13 months, I believe. It's over a period of 13 months, but I think it's 10 weekends, 10 3-day weekends. So I'm very, very much looking forward to that. But taking on IFS as well would be too much. And I'm kind of thinking of doing brain spotting. That's just a weekend. So I might do that. Just a 3-day weekend. I think that's in June. I'm not positive. I mean, of course, it's offered all around the world, but I think in my area, it's in June. So I hope this little conversation, this one-sided conversation with me talking to you, has given you more to think about regarding parts work and maybe helped to explain some of the things that we were talking about in that interview with Dick Schwartz that may not have been as clear to some of you. I would love for you to call me with your questions about this episode or about the episode with Dick Schwartz. You can call me by going to my website, therapychatpodcast.com, and doing the SpeakPipe button. SpeakPipe. You go on the SpeakPipe button and leave me a message. And so what I'm going to be doing over this coming year is I'm going to have multiple opportunities for you to contact me. I'll either read your question if you email it to me, or I will play your recorded question so you'll be able to hear your voice on the podcast, and I'll answer your question. I'm going to be doing this in an upcoming episode. There was a caller who asked a question about the episode I did with Tamara Hill on trauma bonding. And she had some questions about that episode. So I'm going to answer those questions in a future episode. And it will probably be more than one episode that it will take to answer her questions. And I think that's great because, I want you to, really feel like you understand what's being discussed and give you something to think about. So just want to give you a couple resources. These are from the selfleadership.org website. That is the IFS website. There's a book called Many Minds, One Self, written by Dick Schwartz and Robert Falconer, that is available on their website, and you can probably find it on Amazon too. There's another one. It's about intimate relationships that's called You Are the One You've Been Waiting For by Dick Schwartz. You are the one you've been waiting for, bringing courageous love to intimate relationships. And there are others, but there's another one called Self Therapy by Jay Earley, Earley, that is really for the general public. And he also has one called Freedom from Your Inner Critic. There are a lot of other books, a ton of other books. I guess the self-therapy book is volume 1, 2, and 3, and then it also has a workbook. So these are just some books that you could read to get more information. They're not necessarily only for professionals. There are a lot of other books that are more clinical for professionals on that website as well. So plenty of resources. And if you're anywhere near the Baltimore area or you can get there, the Ference Institute Trauma Certificate Program is so worth the money and more. All right, so that is it for today. Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat. I hope this episode was informative, and if I left something out, which is highly possible, please get in touch with me. therapychatpodcast.com. Go to the SpeakPipe button and leave me a message, and you might hear your question on the air in the future. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, take care. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to Therapy Chat today. I hope you have found this compilation of past episodes about dissociation interesting. And I'd be very curious to hear any questions you may have, any thoughts. Does this match up with what you've learned? Are your experiences different? I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget, next week's episode will be my interview with Christine Forner of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, ISSTD. Can't wait for that. Until then, be well. Today's episode is sponsored by Therapy Notes. There are many ways to keep your practice organized, but Therapy Notes is the best. Their easy-to-use, secure platform lets you not only do your billing, scheduling, and progress notes, but also create a client portal to share documents and request signatures. Plus, they offer amazing unlimited phone support, so when you have a question, you can get help fast. To get started with the practice management software trusted by over 60,000 professionals, go to therapynotes.com and start a free trial today. If you enter promo code TherapyChat, they will give you 2 months to try it out for free. Just another reminder that if you'd like to become a member of Therapy Chat, supporting the podcast while receiving fun member perks and being able to communicate with me one-on-one, go to patreon.com/therapychat. If every subscriber donated just $1 per month, Therapy Chat would be able to keep going strong indefinitely. Thanks so much for your support.
Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat with your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. For more information, please visit therapychatpodcast.com.